Okay, everyone, we'll go ahead and get started. So I'm Penny Atkins. I am the Director of Research and Science here at SKI and largely work with our 1U Responsible AI initiative. Dietram is one of our distinguished visitors with our program, and so he is here this week. He'll be here again in early November and again in December. So if you like what you hear and you haven't had a chance to talk with him in more in depth, we do have a social immediately after, but please make sure to touch base with him in the future. I'll also quickly say that if you haven't yet, please register for our symposium in September. But other than that, I want to focus the time on Dietram since he's here this week, and Isabel Freiling, who's one of our distinguished visitors, or sorry, faculty fellows, will introduce Dietram.
Thank you.
Thank you, Penny.
Yes, so Dietram is a principal investigator at the Morgridge Institute for Research and the Taylor Bascom Chair, and well as Distinguished Achievement Professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His current research examines how algorithmically curated information environments fundamentally reshape how we all make sense of the world around us. And his most recent works have been on topics like mis- and disinformation, open science, and the societal impacts of emerging technologies like AI and human brain organoids. He is an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the German National Academy of Science and Engineering, the Wisconsin Academy of Sciences, Arts and Letters. He is also an elected fellow of the American Academy of Political and Social Science, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and the International Communication Association, and a lifetime associate of the U.S. National Research Council. That was a lot. And with that, welcome, Dietram. We're happy to have you here and looking forward to your talk.
Thank you, Isabel. I was really excited about Isabel pronouncing my last name, since I usually don't get fellow Germans to pronounce it, but she didn't, so she avoided that successfully. Yeah, but thank you for that introduction, and thank you most importantly for having me. I really appreciate being here again on campus. I've only been here once. And also for the opportunity, hopefully, for lots of back and forth. One of the things that I would encourage you also as I walk through this, this is a talk that's hopefully positioned between disciplines. So part of my appointment is over in the biomedical sciences in our private research arm here at Wisconsin. And part of it is in the College of Ag and Life Sciences in a more traditional communication or science communication program. So I'm very used to presentations where there are more conversations than anything else. So if anything comes up during the slides, please raise your hands, interrupt, or just speak up. Let me see if this comes somewhat back to my remote actually working. I want to touch on, and I did what everybody else does, right? I went to OpenAI and DALL-E and kind of asked, what does science, the relationship between science and society look like in 2050, and have it make a 16:9 picture. This is the very guardrailed imagination of AI. I'll come back to the idea of guardrailing in a little bit. And I want to touch on three aspects in particular. Oops. One is, and there's a little bit of a lag, so I apologize in me clicking. One of them is the idea of wicked science and AI being wicked science. Some of you will be familiar with that concept, but for those of you who are not, I want to just do a little bit of a deeper dive in why we've struggled so much with that aspect for AI. Since I come from a communication background, I do want to talk about a little bit why AI matters so much for the information ecologies that we find ourselves in, and maybe might explain some of the political complexities that we're currently working our way through. And then I want to spend most of my time talking about three or so challenges that I see as particularly pressing, ranging from hallucinations and AI as an epistemic tool and some other things. So let me start with the idea of wicked science, and you guys will appreciate this. This is, well, maybe more when you drive skiing to Park City, but this is LA on Thanksgiving. This is the traffic in LA. And the idea of a wicked problem is one that came out of urban planning. A guy named Hans Wittel, German born at Berkeley, at some point came up with the idea that scientific issues, most of scientific issues, are actually issues that don't have a clear-cut solution. They don't have a best case solution, right? I could tax people out of driving cars in LA, but that would disproportionately affect people who work 3 jobs and have to drive around town. It would not matter to people living in West Hollywood or working for Paramount. I could create a better subway system, but in an earthquake-prone area, that's probably also not ideal. I could do tons of things, all of which have upsides and downsides, and none of which are a perfect solution. What they all require is some form of value trade-off, meaning individual liberties versus collective good versus environmental impacts. And they require policy action. So that's what a wicked problem is. It doesn't have a best case solution, it requires value trade-offs and some form of policy action. And AI, of course, fits right into all of those categories. Virtually any application of AI, we started in the very beginning when this first came up, and there were these early studies that you will all remember. Can AI tell if somebody is gay from a picture, and so on, and concerns about training data. So this was years ago. And that has, fast forward to now, this is just recently, where we're now going into technologies like gait recognition, as students are masking up to not be recognized by ICE during a Palestinian demonstration. It doesn't matter anymore, because just from the way you walk, I can basically identify who you are, and Europeans are using that to control border entry into the Schengen area. So that tells you already how quickly AI has maybe even has always been, but certainly has turned into a wicked problem. Of course, AI has been around for a long time, and even the threshold when it comes to computational capacity and storage capacity, the crossing that threshold that really pushed us into the academic and maybe public mainstream was a while ago, with maybe DeepMind being the purchase of DeepMind by Google being one of the core moments. And I just put this definition up from Hasabi's way back when, because it still has all the little maze and hypotheticals in there, right? We may at some point be able to synthesize these data, and obviously British spelling here, and use that technology. Well, since then, a lot of things have happened. At the beginning, we said, we understand the wickedness of AI. We're actually going to create an ethics board. DeepMind said that not because we know it's going to do something bad, but because we don't know what AI will be doing. That ethics board has been largely unused, and we can talk about why that was, and really hasn't played a major role in the development of AI. Even as some of the more controversial initial kind of experimentations around LLMs and other things happen, and everybody ran into the same problem. Meta did, or Facebook at the time, and others ran into some of the same problems with bots learning each other's language that engineers couldn't understand, and so on and so forth. At end market applications, that became a more concrete problem. Many of you have, I'm sure, work in that space, self-driving cars needing to make moral judgments. If I drive my Tesla, I don't have a Tesla, but if I drove my Tesla down the road, or I take a Waymo, right, whatever, grandmother stands by the side of the street, kindergarten class crosses the street, and I'm the driver. This is, works in Utah, works in Wisconsin. I spin out of control on black ice. What does the car do? Does it sacrifice me as the driver? Does it sacrifice the grandmother? Does it sacrifice the kindergarten class? It needs to make a choice in some way, shape, or form. And that choice, of course, we largely have crowdsourced and then integrated into neural networks. But you can see where the complexities are. Fast forward to Facebook glasses, people hacking them in order to dox people just literally as they appear in front of them, immediately connecting to various databases. Leading to now, and this is kind of where I want to end, or at least want to end that quick timeline, with Hasabi being one of 4 people who won a Nobel Prize, one of many people who do computational work in biology and other areas of science, where we're now fundamentally transforming through AI what science looks like. Social science is one of those fields. Biology is another one, where lab experimental biology is on its way out. There just will be no use very soon of discovering proteins in a lab biological setting, and AlphaFold and other tools will, or have already kind of replaced this. So very clearly, we've had a semi-long run, right? We've had a decade plus or so of at least societally conscious work through AI. But even when we know that a wicked problem is coming our way, and all of these indicators were there, we have a really hard time as a society figuring out how to deal with it. I'll use one example. We did a report for the National Academies on the future of human genome editing, CRISPR tools, many of you know of them. So making edits to the human germline, to the human genome that is either somatic or germline. Tons of ethical questions, tons of policy questions, tons of value questions. But most importantly, unbelievably exciting applications similar to AI. We can cure genetically inherited diseases like sickle cell that are debilitating for the people that have them. But when you look at and that of course also help most minoritized populations, certainly in sickle cell for sickle cell disease for people of African descent. But when you look at the applications, even a somatic treatment is between $2 and $3 million, which will not help a lot of African Americans in this country who don't even have health insurance, who don't even have dental insurance. And even if they had health insurance, a $3 million treatment would be very expensive for them either way. AI, not much different. As we're thinking through some of the complexities, the people who help us think through those complexities was a great piece in the Washington Post. If you look at Nature and Science, so some of our leading journals, as they publish articles on the ethics of AI and some of the complexities of wicked science, out of 33 people that are writing about this at the time of the Washington Post article, all but one was on the payroll of tech firms, if that's Google, if that's Microsoft, if that's anybody else, Meta or anybody else. So even if we know that wicked science is coming our way, we punt and or turn to people, and I'll come back to this idea in a little bit, that may have some conflicts of interest. Let me put it this way. I'll return to this. This is particularly pronounced in my field, and we all know this, right? We went from an era of, or from decades of broadcasting. We take news, we take information, we send it to everybody in the country. One piece of news goes out to 350 million Americans, and we go now to an area of narrowcasting, of tailoring information toward the individual. And that's been going on for a long time. This is not new in any way, shape, or form. In fact, that's been the holy grail of social media, is to make content so appealing, and platforms like Insta, like TikTok, like whatever else. I just saw that our president joined TikTok as well as of today, right before the deadline comes up for banning it in the US or for forcing a sale. But the idea is to keep you on the platform as long as possible so I can collect as much data from you as I possibly can. And we've done that for a long time by exploiting limitations of human cognition, that I can't tell the difference between a fully fabricated, this is not a deep fake, this is simply a synthetic creation of Trump speaking with the research assistant at Stanford moving his mouth, and then Trump's voice comes out, and it looks indistinguishable from a real Trump interview. More than 10 years ago, Amazon started using algorithm and predictive modeling to ship stuff to shipping centers in different parts of the country. So by the time you order it, so I want to know if, let's say in my case, I live in Madison, there's no distribution center. I buy a garden hose just to show you how boring my life is. And I want to have that one-day shipping Prime, right? That's why I pay for Prime, but it's sitting somewhere in California. So if all my friends start buying these garden hoses, if they overhear and my phone talks about garden hoses and whatever else, and I do searches, there's probably a garden hose that's going to be shipped to a distribution center in Chicago or somewhere in Illinois. So when I order it, it can make it up to Madison really quickly. So we've done this, again, for decades, or at least for more than a decade. In news, no article that you read in the New York Times, or few articles you'll read in the New York Times, are not A/B tested. Meaning before they go online in 5 different versions. The article is the same, but the lead and the headline is different. And within 15 minutes, they've calculated what engagement is on social, what the reach is, and so on. And whatever headline and lead produced the biggest impact, that's what ends up running for the rest of the life cycle of the article. And certainly for few of us who still read in print, that's what ends up in print. That's the recipe for search. That's the recipe for social. And that's increasing the recipe for what some people euphemistically call bespoke AI. I'll come back to that idea in a little bit, but tailored AI toward individuals. And then, of course, we create content using AI. Content that we all think is written by humans. We've done this for a long time on reports on the stock market, right? So every quarterly earnings report you can really easily program what it's going to say. This percentage is going to be a strong, whatever week, and so on, performance of that stock. And so they've always been written, or for a long time been written by AI. But now we're going to examples where the LA Times has experimented with op-eds and then running a counter op-ed. So the counter view written by AI and running those AI-generated op-eds. That was a short-lived experiment because it started endorsing the KKK really quickly, which is probably not a good opener for a general counter argument. But of course, it eventually will work out those kinks, and we'll see more and more of them. So what that ultimately ends up producing is, I think, an inevitable, and I called it in the title for my talk when I sent it to Penny, a synthetic reality. I think it's almost a post-synthetic reality, because it's impossible to distinguish synthetic content from real content, from objectively true content. This is old work, really old work in communication. Those of you who are from a communication department will recognize this as Jeremy Bailenson work at Stanford, where he just very crudely took Photoshop and layered himself and his research assistant on top of Bush and Kerry at the time, and basically wanted to figure out if I have text accompanying picture 1 or picture 2, real Bush versus, well, that's great that my messaging. Hopefully there's not some other messages coming up, but this is going to be funny. But the text that accompanies these pictures, I will trust those statements and that text more if it has a little bit of myself in it. Right? And because why? Because I basically see myself in Bush or in Kerry, and all of a sudden I'm beginning to endorse that the message that they're putting in front of me much more. You can already see the applications as your camera is turned on, as tons of pictures of all of us are floating around as you're checking in at the airport, and you don't have to show your passport anymore because, of course, facial recognition tells them that you're sitting in seat 16B. What the applications are, and this is, you don't really need the audio, but this is what I mean by synthetic realities. It's done by a company called DeepNet in Amsterdam. So you can see Morgan Freeman, and it's actually not as choppy as it comes across with a lag on Zoom. It's actually a pretty smooth video. It sounds like Morgan Freeman. It looks like Morgan Freeman. There's absolutely no way of distinguishing this from a real video, even though it's fully synthetic. And the guardrails that we have on this at the moment are guardrails that are 100% imposed by industry or self-imposed by industry. Meaning industry is saying, look, the fact that I can take 15 seconds of anybody's voice in this room as you're asking a question later, can record 15 seconds of your question, and then I can create any synthetic statement from you that I'm then going to use in a court proceeding or in any kind of lawsuit against you. You can already see how this is going off the rails very, very quickly, yet we have absolutely no legal framework to really deal with that. And I'll push this a little bit further later when I talk about some of the legal applications in child pornography and other areas where AI is maybe unsurprisingly, but depressingly a huge issue. So all of that to just do the last depressing piece, and then I'll go into some of the deeper dive on the 3 cases, is where our information environment is going. These are older data. I'll show you newer data in a second, but they're older data that I keep using because it's really been the last 5, 6, 7 years. This is from Oxford University, the Reuters Internet Institute. And I would kind of urge you to draw an imaginary line here, well, actually here, between what's called younger and older folks. For those of you who are in that group, welcome to the old group, 35 plus. And then orange and blue. Blue is of course, our students mostly, our undergraduate students. But this is me, right? This is me turning on my phone in the morning. I'm getting news alerts from the New York Times, from the Wall Street Journal, whatever else. I may even go to their website directly. I may even read the newspaper if I ever see a physical copy, or I get news aggregators, my Apple News, Google News, whatever else. For everybody who is in the blue lines here, if you go left, it's all algorithmic, 100% algorithmic. You see news because they end up on your timeline, or because, more importantly, they don't end up on your timeline. And this is where some of the data from the last election are really fascinating, where research has shown that a lot of people are still concerned about some of the findings that say, well, nobody in this younger group follows any politician or journalist on Instagram. On TikTok, that's kind of weird. You don't really follow people anyway, so that's, I think, less concerning. But the idea that regularly getting news on a platform that is hyper algorithmic, right? I always love when my undergrads explain to me that I don't like TikTok because I just am too old for it, period. It's not that I don't like it. They're like, you don't understand. You need to train the algorithm, and then it's really good, which I think is an interesting way of looking at it because the algorithm, I think, trains you rather than the other way around. But this is where just the growth rates are in the last election cycle, right? And this is not going to get any better or worse. It's going to get just more pronounced. And it's not a good or bad thing. It's just the new normal of delivery of news that follows basic economic principles of maximizing the audience around content that they like. And we have a commercially driven media system in the US, and so that's just an inevitable outcome. So let me start with one of three challenges that I think are really important here. One is the idea of bespoke, as I said, AI, as it's sometimes called. We had the same transformation for AI-based policing when Palantir was first rolling out their software. It was called AI-based policing. Now it's called enhanced human policing. Right? So it got reframed when people started freaking out that we had AI to identify neighborhoods and individuals and to target them for police intervention. Same thing, I think, is true for bespoke AI. It just sounds so much better than micro-targeted AI. But IBM and everybody else is trying to do the same thing. Obviously, this is and I'll show you applications from Google in a second, so I'll come back to this slide. But before I do that, I just want to show you how powerful that effect is, partly because Sarah is here. Again, happy birthday, Sarah. This was work that we did together a long time ago, 11 years to be, no, 10 years, oops, 2015. Where we wanted to figure out what is it in human nature that makes us select news based on our political, ideological, value-based preferences, rather than based on the information itself. And we picked a topic that was pretty neutral, nano silver, right? So kind of applications in various kinds of medicine, washing machines, other things. So this is when nanotechnology first hit the consumer end market. And we wanted to know what happens if we put people into a gated information environment, semi-social media related. We randomized all the different things that they could read about. We told them we would ask them a bunch of follow-up questions and they could just catch up really quickly on the topic. But the most important manipulation in this was the cue. Liberal MSNBC, conservative Fox News, and then Canadian, at the time, still neutral. Now that would probably not be considered neutral given our latest adversarial relationship with our 51st colony or whatever we call that state. So point being, at the time, really nice, clean, left, liberal, left, right, and then neutral in the middle, Canadian. And the findings are about as clear as they're depressing, and they tell you exactly what that human nature is that bespoke AI or micro-targeted AI is playing to. So if you look at the X down here, you see basically self-reported ideology, liberal, conservative on both social and economic issues averaged out, and then just the first article that they clicked on. There's other data, but this is just the first article that they clicked on. And it's as clean as it's depressing, as I said. If you're conservative, you're not going to MSNBC. If you're liberal, you are going to MSNBC. And then vice versa, liberal to conservative. For Fox News, liberals will not click on a Fox News news topic, but they will click, or not on an MSNBC, but they will click on a Fox News topic as their first click. So point being, we will ignore the content in front of us. We will ignore the science. And the cue that we're following is our personal preference, which is exactly what tailoring online is all about. It's about giving us what we want rather than what we probably should know or should see. And some of the last week, just the rollouts last week that Google did on what's now possible. Now, Google News, you could always use sliders to turn certain sources up and down, right? That was always possible. But now you can actually get your Gemini results tailored where you can say, I want more from, let's say, the information or more from Mashable, and I want less from Fox News, or I want more from MSNBC and less from Fox News. Meaning I can supercharge, I can put on steroids my worst instincts, as I think I put it somewhere in the title. And of course, the same thing happens when those of you who use Notebook LM have probably played around with creating these perfectly nice podcasts from texts that you upload and materials that you upload. It does the same thing now from your daily lists, where it just creates a perfectly human-sounding podcast back and forth, summarizing all the things that you've always been interested in and ignoring everything that you never wanted to hear, meaning perfecting your filter bubbles and your echo chambers to a level that was just not even possible in the more distant past. And the reason I'm looking at my watch is not because I want this to be over, but because I want to make sure that I leave time for questions. So that brings me to my second point, and that is how much of that problem do we actually really understand? And this is where I'm expecting a lot of pushback from this group, but I'll walk you through what I think my argument would be, and why we have a problem between the data asymmetries, and for that matter, infrastructure asymmetries, when it comes to computational power between industry and academia. We had that for social media. It is exponentially worse, obviously, for AI and generative AI in particular. So what we've done for social media, when you look at a lot of the research, we've done a lot of proxy type designs, and down here you see a reference. Oops, I didn't replace it with forthcoming. I did it on one slide, not on this one. This is a piece that actually just came out that Isabel Freiling and I and a colleague at Wisconsin wrote in PNAS, where we kind of made the argument around these data asymmetries, and where we're saying, look, we've done surveys designs where we ask people, how do you use AI? How do you use social media? We've created little scripts and Python scripts to allow us to mock up Instagram posts and maybe even kind of simulate bots. And then, of course, we acknowledge that all of that has flaws, and David Lazar and others have written about this. This may not be a Lazar. Oh no, this is Jürgen Pfeffer, who is now at the TMU in Munich when he was still at Carnegie Mellon, showing the inherent flaws of all the APIs that we had at the time when Twitter still had an API, and Firehose versus others, Garden Hose APIs, and how distorted a lot of the findings were. So totally imperfect research environment for one of the most disruptive phenomena that we had in our society, right? Filter bubbles and echo chambers feeding polarization. We're reaching to a point in this country where we can't even agree on climate change or on the safety of vaccines or on fluoridation of drinking water. And we're reopening settled science now from the highest federal levels. And regardless of what your politics are, that's a phenomenon, no matter how you evaluate it, that we all acknowledge exists. That, of course, has had serious issues. That's why I did replace the 2025. I knew I did it on one slide. So what is the data problem? And I'll just walk you through this for, let's say, studying polarization in the last election. So I'm studying polarization. I'm looking at Facebook data, TikTok data, Instagram data, whatever I try to look at, right? So I can basically analyze the content. I can go in, I can scrape, maybe I have volunteered data, maybe I have a relationship with Meta and they shared some data with me. I can analyze what's in there, how polarized it is, how hostile the conversations are, and so on. I see, of course, only the ones that they give me access to that are not behind passwords, that are not distorted by A/B testing that's constantly going on, that commercial A/B testing, by constraints on APIs, by algorithmic curation of timelines that I don't know because they're all individualized to any given person based on digital trace data and so on. I can also get user data to some degree. I can get some user data. I can guess what they're totally blanking on his name right now at Penn, who was at Microsoft before. Doesn't matter. He's an integrated knowledge professor at Penn now. He has done work on inferring from user patterns what their ideology is. So I can get some idea of what demographics are, priors, and so on. What I can't do, for instance, and this is already our first problem, is I actually don't know, and this is something that Meta knows, this is something that Google knows, all the people who were really irritated by what Facebook did during the last election with fact-checking went to Parler, went to Truth Social. So they moved to other platforms. I don't know if they moved to other platforms. I don't know if the lack of polarization that I'm observing now is actually because the most extreme people left and went elsewhere. And as a result, polarization goes down on Facebook. I also actually don't know what's really going on, how these people interact, and as their timelines get varied, as they interact with offline communication, and so on. All of these things Facebook knows because they buy offline data on a regular basis. They, of course, have all the trace data that shows them where other people go, what other accounts they have, and so on and so forth as they're merging data sets. And none of this academia can do. That's not the fault of academia, but that's an inherent problem that we're having as we're trying to solve large societal challenges. And as those asymmetries in data get wider and wider. I want to highlight one case, and a lot of the people who contributed to these studies are good friends, so I'm saying this with the utmost respect to the authors, but I want to walk through 4 studies that came out in Science and Nature. And Isabel and I and Nikki Krause talk about this in the PNAS piece, that came out in Science and in Nature, as I said, that basically made the argument that polarization during the 2020 election was not as bad as it seemed, and that it was not really driven by algorithms and social media firms, but really by our interpersonal biases more than anything else. Those data were shared by Facebook to a group of researchers that were largely handpicked. Think this through for any other scientific issue, if we did that for other research. The raw data, some of the raw data wasn't shared with the researchers. Facebook analyzed it for them and gave them basically results. So they didn't fully give access under the guise of privacy concerns. Some of the key variables, including misinformation, was coded directly by Meta and not by the researchers themselves. And not a single paper was written that did not have a mandatory author from Facebook, or from Meta rather, as a co-author. The reason I put cigarettes and oil here is imagine a study on the carcinogenic effects of cigarettes with a co-author by Philip Morris, with data that has been shared and curated by Philip Morris, with coding of some key variables by Philip Morris, or ExxonMobil. An author from ExxonMobil tells us that there's really not a link between fossil fuels and climate change, or it's not as bad as we thought. And there would be an absolute outrage over immense conflicts of interest. The idea that I can't replicate most of these data because the raw data are not being shared. So as we're talking about a reproducibility and replicability crisis in science, we're building our very own in this particular space. And then ultimately, when it comes to policy interventions, we're in a space where and this is a great piece in the Wall Street Journal, if you haven't read it, where science got into a pretty public fight with Meta and saying, look, if you continue to say that this absolves you from any policy relevance, we're going to say very publicly that you're wrong and that you're misinterpreting this. And I think the communications person for Science Magazine did an unbelievably good job of really standing her ground on that one. All of that, of course, reached its peak a few months later, and this I think was the kicker, when it came out that not only were these all the constraints of the study, but that Facebook had actually, or Meta had implemented break glass measures during this time, meaning if things got too bad when it came to polarization, it implemented algorithmic tweaks that moderated the degree of outrage and of polarization that was put in front of people. So in other words, we have studies that showed that polarization was minimal and didn't really impact the public from a data set that was curated by industry, and that was intentionally and artificially constrained in the amount of polarization that researchers were able to find. Again, port this into any other area of public health or any other of academia, and we're having an academic civil war going. But here, we have no other choice. That's the only way we get even close to these data. So that's why I meant there's nothing to blame the authors here, but there's everything to think about as we're going into the same world for AI, where we're now, and these are all great studies done at Stanford. Kai-Ping Chen is a colleague at Wisconsin in public health. People experimenting basically with these bots at the end user point and figuring out as we're sock puppeting our way through or doing other things, what happens if different kinds of users engage with us and what are the outcomes. So that gets me to my, and I will wrap up in a second here, but to a second point that I think is really important, and that's AI as an epistemic tool, because that makes it fundamentally different from most other areas of science. I can reap the benefits of CRISPR for myself without understanding at all what it is. I don't need to understand it. I need to interact with it meaningfully. I need to maybe make an informed decision, but a medical doctor can help me do that. But AI, I'm actually using as a knowledge tool. I'm actually going in with the expectation that if I ask a question, AI is going to give me a correct answer. And so we've had this problem in misinformation research for a long time. How do we identify misinformation? We've shifted away from taking any given piece of misinformation, because a correct piece of information can become misinformation out of the context. Misinformation can become disinformation, depending on the intent and so on. So this is a great piece that David Lazar, others wrote with a working paper for the National Academy of Medicine, where they said we should shift toward a source credibility model, where we can basically match up pieces of information, and if they come from enough credible sources, then we use them for probabilistic predictions and maybe even, again, AI models. Of course, AI immediately stumbled, right? This is an example, a really good example, where you can easily see how it stumbled. It went to a credible source, a journalist with expertise in an area, who posted an April Fool's joke. Gemini April 1 is the same. Gemini information on April 1 is the same as Gemini information April 2. It doesn't understand the idea of April Fools. So all of a sudden, his April Fool's joke became part of the training data that informed the probabilistic answers that ChatGPT or Gemini or Anthropic or whatever else provides me with. And then, of course, we have the idea of guardrailing here at the end, and I'll walk through the 3 steps in a second. The idea that we train large language models on the cesspool of information that is the internet, and everything most of what comes out is not usable. If you spend any time on the internet, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So very little is actually usable, and how it's being curated for what's supposed to be accurate information ends up on a lot of back-end human intervention, even after the training, even after supervised learning, putting this in front of people. So one of my PhD students, who's defending tomorrow, ironically, so I'm doing this virtually, is doing her dissertation on hallucinations. And she came up with this graph, which I kind of like because it gets to those different layers of distortions. We talked about training data already, the various training processes that we also know very little about because they're largely proprietary, so I don't know how they differ. I know that DeepSeek behaves very differently at end consumer point than ChatGPT does, but I don't know how this influenced it. And then the gatekeeping one at the end, where human engineering will actually stop certain information from getting out. Let's say climate change. If you ask ChatGPT to deny climate change, it will not do it. If you ask DeepSeek, it'll be much more likely to do it. And so her dissertation is looking across scientific issues. I put the QR code here just to, if you want to see her preprint just got accepted yesterday in Harvard Misinformation Review. So I think it's a really good, her first chapter, theory chapter. Of course, that's a problem that's also pretty close to home. One of my PhD students came to me and she said, oh, we got a review on one of our articles. And they asked me to cite your piece. So what the review says, I think there are also exceptional omissions from the literature, including Broussard, Scheufele, Kim, Lewinstein, 2009. And I was like, oh, shit, I got to put that. Sorry, I can't say that. Oh, shoot. I'm going to put that on my CV, except for it doesn't exist, right? Because that piece was never written. It's fully hallucinated, which raises a whole bunch of issues. A, who wrote this review for an academic journal. B, who didn't double check the hallucinations. And C, why the heck, this time I'm not swearing, why the heck on August 18th, 2025, when I asked ChatGPT to summarize this article for me, it'll give me a pretty detailed summary of a non-existing article. Still, a year later, 2 years later after this first appeared. So, and again, the credible source that fed this and feeds this into the academic literature, right, is not helping ChatGPT making probabilistic judgments about what is likely correct or incorrect information and what I should give you when you're asking me for a factually important, correct claim, because that's the important part for hallucinations. It's a system trying to be right about information and by accident being wrong. It's not misinformation or disinformation where I don't care or I really want to deceive people. So some of these things are very fixable, and this is also a good friend, Jeff Hancock, former colleague at Cornell. But he's has become, unfortunately, the poster child because he did an expert testimony, $600 an hour for court in Minnesota on a court case against the Republicans on misinformation, and apparently submitted his last statement to the court after running it through ChatGPT, and which promptly hallucinated two references on misinformation. So an expert on misinformation submitted hallucinated information to a US court, which ended up being a lot of my lawyer friends, love this stuff for obvious reasons, because this is an automatic dismissal. This is easy to fix, and we will fix this. The stuff that I'm getting a review with a hallucinated reference, the fact that all of that stuff will get fixed both at the platform and at the end user end. So I'm not worried about that. What's much more interesting is the unreliability. And you saw Demis Hassabis talk about this recently, and others at Google, this idea of AGI, of artificial jagged intelligence that keeps us from reaching AGI eventually. So this idea that we're winning math competitions, we're beating experts at chess, but we're stumbling on very simple problems. And partly it's related to all of these things that we're talking about. And that brings me to the last point, and that's the idea of ground truth and reality. And I'm not going to go all STS and philosophy of science on you, but there are technical aspects here that are important. And this is where a lot of the interactions I have recently with journalists are journalists who are trying to make sense of legislation that a lot of states, sure, Utah is not any different, Wisconsin is not any different, are trying to put out on things like child pornography. And AI-generated child pornography. And this is where it gets really, really, it should be a very straightforward topic, right? There should be no gray areas at all. But there have always been gray areas. And this is, many of you have seen this case, Ashcroft versus for the Free Speech Coalition. This is one of the early cases on artificially generated, not artificial intelligence, but just artificially generated images, read in every law class. Everybody who went to law school has read this. But it raises some really important issues. So for example, where is the line between training data that is taken from, so how do I create a piece of, and I don't mean to be too graphic here, but how do I create a realistic looking piece of child pornography? What training data do I need to use that? Am I using real pictures? And that's the argument behind a lot of the penalty laws, right? Laws that actually penalize this kind of, or are punitive with respect to that kind of behavior. They want to protect victims. That's the logic of the law. So if there are real victims behind those training data, then those training data represent real images that exist in reality. Where's that gray line between a drawing, a comic book, and where that real line is? And and this is where the economic interests will come in. If I'm a platform provider and I'm buying into the argument that there's real data behind child pornography and that there's therefore a link to a realistic depiction at some point, then this is, and many of you saw this, obviously the guess ads that you'd use an artificially created model or multiple models. Then we're reopening all the debates about artificial intelligence in movies, artificial intelligence in advertising, because this person wouldn't exist without a whole bunch of real pictures of models existing, right? That the platforms learn from, or the bots learn from, the LLMs learn from. So in other words, depending on how I slice the argument, if I'm slicing the argument, well, AI child porn is not really because it doesn't rely on real pictures, then this is fine. But if I'm making the argument it's not okay because it relies on a depiction of a real crime with a real victim, then this all of a sudden raises a whole bunch of issues on copyright, IP, creativity, people's intellectual work, likeness, and so on and so forth. And that's in Wisconsin, of course, as I said, is in the exact same spot that everybody else is in, that we're struggling through that and are trying to figure out how to write laws around a technology where I think nobody has a really good, clean answer on this one. So the one thing, and one of the reasons why it's so exciting to be here, is also because I think there's a lot of our work deals with this question of how do we address wicked problems in a large social setting. This is an interview from Die Zeit, a German newspaper that they conducted, of course, in English, which is fortuitous, because in that interview, Hassabis said that he is hoping that AGI will, before too long, find a unified theory of physics. So the contradictions between Heisenberg and Einstein, micro, macro, right? We will figure out and we'll create this great unified theory. Well, ironically, in the 1960s, 68, I think, or somewhere, if you haven't read this, it's a really good book. It's a play, actually, by a Swiss playwright, Friedrich Dürrenmatt. And it's a play where a scientist discovers exactly this, the unified theory. And he realizes, oh, shoot, this is not good. This is going to lead to weaponry that we will not be able to control, to countries trying to occupy each other, to struggles for power. And he goes to an insane asylum with all his documents and packs up his lab and goes away and tries to protect the world by pretending to be crazy and goes to an insane asylum, except for the KGB and the CIA realize what he has and also send two agents in who also pretend to be crazy. They call themselves Einstein and Newton, and try to steal the unified theory formula from him. And long story short, fast forward, whole play, spoiler alert, person who runs the insane asylum is the only insane person, frames them all, they get locked up forever, she steals the word formula and takes over humankind. And at the end, they all turn to the audience and basically say, this statement, I tried to translate it and I'm like, I ran out of time. So translating on the fly now, what concerns all of humanity can only be solved by everybody, by all of us together. Any attempt of a single person or a group to slice off part of the problem is bound to fail. So as we're going toward that world formula, this was written during really the panic over nuclear energy and kind of what we had unleashed on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and then of course in Europe during the Cold War. But he used, ironically, the exact same, which is why Die Zeit asked him that question about unified theory. But so we're beginning to cycle through the same big questions, and we're getting really close to answering some of those questions that may put us in front of really uncomfortable, wicked problems. We did a long time ago, this was at the very beginning of DeepMind's work. We did a white paper for DeepMind. This was Liz Neely, who was at the time still at the Story Collider, and I, a white paper, an invited white paper for DeepMind. We traveled to London. We talked to them about, what is coming your way in terms of these public dynamics surrounding it and how can you deal with it. It's a proprietary one, so I can't share it. But it was the beginning of a conversation that so I think DeepMind they're very aware of the issue. Let's just put it that way. When Chuck Schumer invited a bunch of tech leaders to the White House to think through AI regulation without necessarily talking to a lot of the communities that will be affected, we wrote this piece where we really said, look, we need broad public engagement. And one of the things that we're currently working on, I just wanted to leave you with that, is a large Templeton-funded grant, John Templeton Foundation, looking at how we can build large-scale conversations and public engagement, what we call good faith. This is a bit of a wordplay, of course, for religious and communities of faith. Engagement between the public and some of those issues, but also the scientific community as it rethinks, and this goes back to the physicist example, the play, but as we're developing tools that have immense impacts, that have the potential to have immense impacts of what it means to be human, what conflict will look like, global conflict will look like, what warfare will look like, what health will look like, what genetic information and the information we can extract from it will look like. How can we build the infrastructure within academia and within the public to scale that up? And it will end at the end of this upcoming year with a meeting of philanthropy. So, and a lot of the public engagement efforts Isabel and I have worked on, and others in this room. That's kind of where hopefully I want to leave you as a starting point for conversations as we're as I'm wrapping up this visit, or not wrapping up, but going through this visit and then visiting again at later points in the fall. So with that, I will leave you. I went over a little bit, my apologies, but I really appreciate again the opportunity to chat with you. Thank you.
And we have a little bit of time for questions. I see a hand.
Hi, my name is Samir Patel. I'm an associate professor here in the Collard School of Computing. I actually have two questions, but I'll ask one and let's see if I can articulate it well. So you mentioned a lot of these effects, right? Polarization, filter bubbles, and the way AI is amplifying them or introducing newer ones. what is your, and you may not have an answer to this, but just maybe perhaps speculation, but what is your sense? To what extent are these effects common across our shared humanity, regardless of where people are?
Yeah.
And to what extent do you think there are social, cultural, economic, political, contextual variables that are associated and that influence how these things manifest? And maybe to provide some reason behind why I'm asking this. So for example, we don't necessarily see the same kind of, let's just call it dumbing down in some other countries, like Germany, for example, or China, as we might be experiencing here in the US and some other things. So I'm wondering to what extent this is driven by something that's shared across humans as human beings, and to what extent there are particulars of the context that are playing a role here.
Absolutely, yeah, super good question. So I'll start with what I think are the commonalities, right? And there's tons of, I teach a class, and I will next week, well, week after that, start teaching a 300 student undergrad class in science, media, and society. And we work exactly through that question, kind of what are the commonalities. And we know from sociology, for instance, the idea of homophily. So the idea that birds of a feather flock together. I don't know what Salt Lake looks like, but even Madison, which is a fairly small community, is hyper-segregated, meaning I live in what my students call faculty ghetto, meaning there's a bunch of university professors who all want their kids to go to a good school, and they all are sent to, that's where the best high schools are. They're all voting Democrat, big D Democrat. And then other populations live further south, and that even those are racially segregated. Point being, we have always sought out living arrangements, spousal arrangements that really are built on similarities. I mean, if you look at people's Tinder profiles, that you probably will see people asking for similarities that they really want to see with their prospective spouse. So that idea of homophily, I think, is really old, and it's universal. I don't think that's unique to the US or to, I mean, you see the same thing in other metro settings all over the world. I think the same thing that's also similar are some aspects of human nature. If that's selective exposure, for instance, or the idea that if I give people the choice, you saw the Sarah study, that if I give people a choice to find belief consistent information versus belief inconsistent information, it's just human nature, and that's old Gestalt psychology from the 1920s. That says, I'm going to seek out information that fits my priors. What I didn't talk about, just for the sake of time, is also motivated reasoning, meaning all of us, and I would include every single person, including myself in this room, don't process information neutrally. We weigh information more heavily if it fits our prior beliefs, values. That's also a fairly universal thing. The exact same phenomenon that makes Americans reject information on climate change, conservative Americans because they don't like it, makes liberal Germans reject scientific consensus on genetically modified crops. So it applies everywhere. So that's the first part of your question. I think they're hard to change. I mean, it's like these are stripes on a tiger. It's just hard to do. But there are others, and I think that's where you're absolutely right, where either there's room for interventions or there's lessons to be learned from cultural differences and structural differences. Political system being one. And I'm saying this with the utmost sincere apologies to everybody in this room who's American, but everything in this country is dichotomous, right? There's a major league, your baseball is like structured. There's a pyramid that you play out, and then there's whatever the final one is called, the World Series. Football is exactly the same way. Parties are the same way. Political parties, everything is dichotomous, and you have a choice between one and the other. Very different in multi-party systems, right? That's already where polarization is much harder to manifest to the same degree. Hasn't stopped countries like Germany from having broad-scale denying of vaccine safety and other things, but it's not the same political polarization. Number one. Number two, I think is the media system, and that's I've said this very often, and I didn't say this in this talk, but if I was advising Mark Zuckerberg or Sergey Brin, if he's still involved, or Larry Page or whoever else, I would advise them to do exactly what they're doing. They're doing commercially the right thing. You want to keep users as long as possible on your platform and not have them go to any other platform, get all the data out of them, and ideally merge it with all the biomarkers you get from 23andMe and whatever else. That's where the profit is. That's where the richest data are. That's where the best models are. That's just model quality. democratically, of course, that's totally not what I would like to see, but commercially it makes total sense. So unless we have a media system that is different, let's say in Germany is another good example. I think Britain is an in-between example because they commercialized the public media system a little bit. And I'm not as familiar with many of the other countries, but Germany has an unbelievably well-funded public television system, right, and public media system, which means you will be exposed, if you like it or not, to information that will sometimes rattle your cage. You cannot perfectly select out unless you really select fully out of a well-funded public media system. We don't have that in this country, and we have it even less so a few months into the current administration than we did before. So I think the commercial interests are going to be a really interesting one, and you see even for analysis of DNA data, right, where I need for epigenetics, where I need digital trace and behavioral data and merge that with genetic data. That's why we're seeing Britain sequencing every newborn child. That's why we see China building gigantic databases as countries. We're not doing it as countries. We're doing it commercially. We're doing this on the Google side and basically, and we did the same thing for sequencing of DNA. So I think that's where another one is you do it on the commercial side, they'll have to maximize profit. At the end of the day, they need to make $1 more than they invested in it. If you're doing the public side, you have much more control over the social potentially adverse effects. So I think there's the reason why I'm pessimistic, just to give a downer at the end, is because I just don't think that this country is ready for serious regulatory intervention, and that's going to be the interesting model, the interesting problem, especially in our current political climate. So we'll see how it goes. That's the downer answer. Sorry.